We've got this danger area at both ends.
And it's really interesting that complacency is happening at both ends, but for really different reasons.
Yeah.
One is because actually that...
We've already begun to start talking about how we can recognize it. But let's talk about how we can recognize it in ourselves.
The more confident you feel about the task that you're about to do, the less likely it is that you feel that you need to pay the attention that you need to actually complete that task properly. You rush a task. Why is that? It can sometimes be organizational factors. And I think it's important for people, especially in managerial type positions, to understand that.
Luke, it's great to have you on the podcast again. Today, we're going to be talking about complacency, which we talk about quite a lot in aviation maintenance specifically, and in the classroom when we come in once every couple of years to talk about human factors. But what do we mean by complacency and why is it so important?
I think complacency is one of those ones which is just so prevalent but so difficult to spot. It happens all of the time for each one of us.
Yeah.
And I think the more you do a task, the more likely it is that complacency is going to start creeping in. You just accept that norm is going to creep in, and we are used to seeing things happen in a certain way.
Yep.
And therefore, that's what we expect to happen next time around.
Very good. So just a couple of ideas around to set the scene about what complacency is and what it might look like in the aviation environment. So quite typically a mechanic or technician doing a routine check.
I think the key part of that is routine. The more routine that task is, the more likely we're doing. So as you say, a mechanic has done the task a million times before. They're expecting the outcome to be the same, and therefore the amount of due diligence that you pay on that particular task,
very good.
Just really not going to be the same level as if it's the first time you've done it.
And you said something quite interesting there. You talked about expectations. Actually, expectations play a massive part in here, because if we expect something to be okay, or we expect not to find something, then the chances are we're not going to. And so we might say that actually complacency has played a major role in that decision. So let's just talk then very briefly about what complacency is, because I know that DuPont, when he put together the Dirty Dozen that we often refer to in the dog-eared posters that we see around the facilities, what was his definition? It talks about a couple of things in that.
The key areas really around that is about this idea of self-satisfaction. So it's looking at somebody who they don't necessarily have an appreciation of the mindset that they're in necessarily. So the first bit being that self-satisfaction piece. And the next bit being all around failing to recognize actually the risk associated with that task. So the combination of an overconfidence of an engineer or anybody really, ground handlers, whatever it might be, that overconfidence without recognizing the risks of the task that we're doing.
Yeah.
So it just paves the way for complacency to creep in.
Okay. So it's talking about how we can become overly confident in our own abilities. That's interesting. So it's not just about the routine nature of a task, but we can inflate our own abilities, right?
Absolutely. And the reality is that the more confident you feel about the task that you're about to do, the less likely it is that you feel that you need to pay the attention that you need to actually complete that task properly. And that's where you naturally lead into skipping steps in a task, because you've either done it or lots of times before. Or again, you've got that confidence that you ultimately know better.
Yeah. Yes, that's very interesting, because I'm just in my mind, I was thinking, somebody who's freshly come out of college, they've just passed their exams in whatever area of discipline they've studied, and then they get their first job. So they're going to be absolutely on the ball. Maybe they're paying even more attention to what they're doing because, hey, I've just got my qualification or my license or approval, and I don't want to mess up. So I'm putting in that extra time. I'm being more diligent. So in that kind of circumstance, that individual is possibly less likely to become complacent because they are more aware.
It's that self-awareness to me, I think, is that real key barrier to stopping you from slipping into this trap.
Yeah.
We can think about complacency not just in the work environment, but in our day-to-day lives. The more, again, I keep talking about this frequency of tasks, but whether it's how much thought you have to put into the task that you're doing. And the more frequently you do something, the more familiar you are with it. The more familiar you are with it, the less likely it is that you're going to give it its full attention. And because you're not now giving it your full attention, it's where you start skipping over steps that happened before, because you're automating these processes. And ultimately the brain gets lazy. It knows how to get from A to B.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And you say A to B, well, probably no better example than driving a car.
Absolutely.
So you first pass your license, you're going to be more aware of what's going on around you, more aware of the actions that you're doing to manually drive that car, get from A to B. And then I know that over the years, the more I've driven and the long journeys I do, especially for work, you can become complacent and find your mind wandering, even to the point where you go from A to B and wonder how you got from A to B.
It's frightening that you're able to do that, but that is the way that the brain works for us. And bringing together the idea of an automation of a task, familiarity of it, you just tune out. And again, there's lots of things that can play into how susceptible you may be to being complacent on it. We've talked about familiarity of the task. Experience potentially is another big one as well, is that if you are very experienced or even not very experienced at all, either ends of those spectrums can have a really big difference. Back to that sort of point, explanation of what complacency is.
Yeah.
One of it is about this self-satisfaction, this overinflatedness of ability. But if we put into that as well an awareness of the risk of the task that we're performing, then actually the awareness of the risk might not be there for somebody who's brand new. So
that's very true.
That can be a really big part of playing into how susceptible we might be to be complacent. People don't intentionally do it.
Yeah.
They just don't know they're doing it. They don't.
So we can have somebody at the early entry into their career finding themselves maybe complacent because they're not so aware of the risks attached to not necessarily carrying out the job in the right way.
Yep.
But then equally at the other end, we can have somebody who's been in the industry for decades and they've never had a bad outcome. So actually, and they've done the same tasks over and over again, or the inspections over and over again, never had a negative outcome. And over time, their perception of the risks associated to not carrying out their tasks well has started to fade away in their mind. So yeah, you're right. We've got this danger area at both ends, really.
Yeah. And it's really interesting that complacency is happening at both ends, but for really different reasons.
Yeah.
One is because actually that initial part of that over-inflated sense of ability has really taken hold. And typically, not always, but typically the longer you do a job, the more confident you become in it. And that confidence grows into almost an ego that goes with that.
Yeah.
Which makes that susceptibility. But back down to the brand new person that's just come out, you don't understand the level of risk of what it is that you're doing, then you say you fall into that trap. And how often is it that we understand that if we are really aware of the risk of what we're doing, we pay close attention to it. If we know it's a big deal,
really
we really focus in on it.
Yeah.
If we think it doesn't matter, how much effort do we really put into that? And you just slip through into, well, it doesn't matter. We'll skip this step. We'll miss part of this task. And the outcome is clear.
So you've raised a really good point. We need to be able to recognize it. We've already begun to start talking about how we can recognize it. But let's talk about how we can recognize it in ourselves. So there's a bunch of things that we noted down before we started the podcast about how we can recognize it in ourselves, including, obviously, you mentioned rushing through tasks, maybe even considering skipping steps or taking shortcuts. I know under the operational pressure that people find themselves, especially in our world with aircraft maintenance, maybe it's on the line where you're trying to turn around an aircraft in record time because the airline industry is picking up at the moment, which is amazing. However, alongside that comes the commercial pressures. So what are some of the other personal indicators? Well,
again, on this personal indicator side of things, you rush a task. Why is that? It can sometimes be organizational factors. And I think it's important for people, especially in managerial type positions, to understand that the rushing through of those tasks can cause you to skip various steps. You just haven't got the capacity to be able to move forwards with those things.
And if it's linked to the fact that, well, nothing went wrong before, when I might have taken a shortcut or skipped something this time, making sure I'm going to catch it next time, we're building the complacency. We're allowing the complacency to come in.
Yeah. That over-familiarity as well of those tasks.
Yeah.
You used the driving example earlier on, just because we do it all every day. And because of that, the body, the brain, it's familiar with it because you've got the muscle memory as to what's going on. And therefore the brain thinks it can wander off into a different direction. It can use that time and capacity of not having to think to do something else. Problem is, you get to the end of that drive and you have no idea how you get there. If you do that on anything aircraft related, actually, how confident are we that we've just done an aircraft maintenance task? We've signed it, or we've gotten to the end to sign it off, and we think, I don't actually remember that much about what I did. Is it okay because your body is just in that place and therefore you're confident that you've done it right? or actually have we missed some of those key steps and we don't even know it?
Yeah, really good. Okay, so I think there's another concept here as well, isn't there? And it's around trusting our own skill set.
Yeah. We've talked about how this overinflated of our own ability can lead to it, but trusting your own skill set is, again, a really key point where this complacency can come through. Because when we overly trust ourselves, but sometimes even our peers, that we trust them to have done certain things in steps, we don't check it. And checking that is that complacency beginning to creep into the work that we are demonstrating on a day-by-day basis.
And I suppose the danger there is that it can lead to shortcuts without even necessarily realizing, or even realizing and thinking, actually, we trust in our abilities so much that, hey, it'll be okay.
Yeah. The trusting of the skills, you turn around and you accept that what you're doing is going to be right. And then from that, it then goes through into a very, very slippery slope where it becomes a normalization of deviation of procedures. I know better. I don't need to use tooling. I know better. And that's how it all links together.
So if we really wanted to look at it this early on in this podcast, is to suggest that actually procedures are there to protect us, and procedures are there to try to minimize the potential of being influenced by complacency, right?
Yeah. By having something that is step by step all the way through, you're able to ensure that you consciously go through and perform every task that's required.
Yeah.
You don't get complacent. You don't miss those steps, and you don't then start going along that slope.
Yeah, really good. Yeah. And then we've got the work environment or the work environment indicators as well. And thinking about how the work environment actually can set us up to be influenced by complacency.
Yeah. And again, back to this idea of organizations playing such a key role in how human factors are felt and affected by us as individuals. It's key. So on a managerial side of things, it's about making sure there's enough time so people don't have to skip those steps. If they know that the diligence is available because of the time they've got, absolutely fantastic. But the workplace culture is also a really key one. And my favorite thought, I'm always told I'm quite pessimistic, but the what if.
Yep.
What if this goes wrong? Because really we expect it to go right. Industry has expected it to go right for years and years and years. I think the last time there was a loss of life in the UK on aviation, something like 1983 on a commercial airliner.
Wow.
It's such a long time. The industry almost has pushed us along this road of going, aviation is safe, aviation is safe, aviation is safe, which it is.
Yeah.
But we need to remember it's only safe because of us. It's safe because of our due diligence. It's not safe completely because of, nothing that we do to interfere with that. So we have to understand that organizational culture is forcing us down a road of ask yourself, what if? What if this goes wrong? What could be the outcome for it? And that keeps us alive to it and keeps us really sharp and alert to those things that can be problematic for us.
Good. That's really good. And then we've got the normalization of deviations. So for example, we've always done it this way.
Yeah.
And nothing's ever gone wrong, which again is the behavior going into the outcomes and then reinforcing the belief that, hey, we've always done it that way. Why would we change it?
Yeah. That normalization of the outcome and that route in which we get round can be a really, really dodgy place to be, because again, back to industry giving us this narrative of how safe we are, we come to just live with the risk. Back to the original definition of it, of not really appreciating the risk is a key part of what complacency is. If we pull that back to the organization setup, it really pushes us along a line of, do we recognize the importance of the task? Are we able to really pick out those things which are going to cause a problem?
Yeah.
And when we do recognize those things, it heightens our awareness to make sure that we don't slip down that path.
Yeah, really good. Okay. Which ties in as well with just some other points that I wanted to bring out here. Lack of communication or cross-checking. Culture where questioning authority is also discouraged. And we need to be careful of that as well, that we don't create a culture where speaking up is discouraged, because that can allow complacency to really sweep in.
Yeah. And that lack of communication is a facilitator for this complacency to happen. We assume the other person understands what goes on, the whole world that knits together around how complacency manifests in the workplace.
Okay, so we've come to the end of this topic on complacency. And I think it's an important discussion that we've got to have. However, I'm really keen, as I know you are, that there's some practical tips to take away. So anybody who's thinking to themselves, you know what, I'm engaged in routine tasks all the while. Maybe even I'm kind of in that stage of my career where I'm doing the same thing over and over again. And I often find my mind wandering because I can do the routine with my eyes shut, so to speak. Tell me, let's talk about 3 top things we can do.
One of which is mindfulness. So complacency is one of the weird human factors that actually doesn't manifest itself as something that happens to you. It's something that actually you do to yourself.
Okay.
That complacency comes from within. You have experienced the task so many times that you are now expecting an outcome in a way that you have already seen before. And having that mindfulness, which is a bit of a buzzword, let's talk about it more about, it's actually self-awareness.
Okay.
That's what it is. When I go to work, am I really switched on and engaged to the risks that this task may present? But also, am I overly confident? Have I been doing this for too long that I know what I'm doing. I don't need somebody to tell you this. And the reality is you will be the person that picks up on that better than anybody else. You will recognize the fact that when people come and tell you ideas of how to do your job, you almost find this annoying. It's frustrating. It's like, I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
That is the risk point. That's the bit where you know that you really need to be on guard for complacency.
Yeah. So mindfulness to do with task performance, in essence, is being present in the moment.
Absolutely.
So I'm not finding my mind's wandering. I'm actually paying attention to what's written in the procedure, or I'm paying attention to what I'm seeing when I'm inspecting.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really good. And then we've got double checking and verifying. Now we do talk about a lot about this in the aviation world, but what does this mean? Double checking and verifying. How can that help potentially stop me or prevent me from being complacent?
This idea of thinking about something twice. The first time is an automated thought and the second one is a conscious one to do that. And it's the same with the task. If you've gone through and you've completed a task, quite possibly you'll get to the end of it and you think, well, I get here.
Yeah.
Actually, when you go through and intentionally go through that to verify and check what you've done, you're taking out that automation of what the brain's expecting to see and having a check-in with yourself to say, oh, okay, I need to stop, pause, and look, what am I actually seeing as opposed to what I'm expecting to see?
Yeah, really good. Okay. So it's not necessarily talking about somebody else coming to double check or verify. It's actually being present in the moment and thinking to yourself, I've done this job. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to go grab a coffee and I'm going to come back in a few minutes and I'm just going to double check.
That's exactly it.
Excellent.
We talk about independent inspections and this isn't what this is. This is about your own personal set of work practices where you check in with yourself,
really
back to that mindfulness, to actually check in, what have I just done and what am I expecting to be able to see?
Great. And then finally, we've got fostering a safety culture. Now, often we hear about that in terms of a business or an organization, but I suppose it's partly that, but it's also on a personal level as well. How do we foster a safety culture?
Well, it's back to that idea of checking in with ourselves. You know, we've talked about that mindfulness and we keep going back to it, but fostering a safety culture is actually being aware of yourself.
Yeah.
If you recognize the fact that it's important to be aware of the actions that you're taking because aviation is of a high risk, etc., then the likelihood is that actually you're going to foster an awareness within yourself that this is a risk for you. And you are right. There are 2 aspects to it. There's the personal safety culture, but also it's the environment from the organization that actually really helps drive this as well. That if you have a team that you work with and that team has overinflated themselves almost to be the A team, always the one to watch out for. If you have an A team or an A player or the ones that get stuff done, they're the ones you really need to watch out for because the whole organization is pushing this narrative of these guys get it right every time. These guys get it right every time. And guess what? You start believing it. You start trying less hard because I get it right every time. And organizationally, and even as peers, we have that obligation to make sure that we recognize no one is perfect, including ourselves.
Yeah.
And when we have those open conversations where we say mistakes happen, errors happen, it recognizes that we're all fallible and therefore the ability for those things to go wrong. So that pushes back into that narrative of what if, that pushes back into that idea of self-awareness of,
very good.
I am just human. I am just doing my best in an imperfect world. It could go wrong. Could today be that one? I need to stop. I need to verify and check what I've done to make sure that I have an automatic pilot into that job.
Yeah, very good. Be known for being good, but being good because you're doing these kind of things. You've got these checks and weights and balance
Absolutely.
for yourself. Excellent. Luke, as always, thank you. And yeah, everybody out there, stay safe, work safe, to go home safe. See you next time.
See you then.